Afternoon. Hello, my name is Gary Scudder. I'm a professor here in the core. Once again, ably assisted by the excellent Kristen, who in classic cognitive dissonance has convinced herself that she doesn't actually have to film on herself if she keeps filming me. Having said that, I do appreciate the help. Today, I want to talk a little bit about a subject relating to Core 110 and I guess by extension Core 130, so concepts of the self or the summer bridge. And mainly I want to talk about the Freeland book. And of course this is the book that the students love to hate. They complain endlessly about the Freeland book. I don't know why. My assumption is that the sophomores get to them and tell them that they're supposed to hate the Freeland book, so they complain bitterly about it for no particularly good reason. And they always say, oh, I don't think she writes very well. And of course my response is always, yes, you stated it much more clearly in your book. So what the hell are you talking about? You know, it's funny, like I say, I actually use the Freeland book a lot, and as we all remember, I'm the one person who voted against using the Freeland book. I actually wanted to keep Gombrich. What I tell the students, and I think the key to using the Freeland book is this, is you can't think of it as purely an art book. I mean, Gombrich was an art book, that huge tome. It was physically art. Why students struggle with Freeland, and why I think the Freeland book, Portraits and Persons, is actually a very good fit, is that this is much less an art book than it is a philosophy book. I mean, if the class is Concept of the Self, this is really a class about the self. And she's really much more interested in the concept of the self, and then she expresses it through art. So I think you do learn some art, but you also learn a hell of a lot more about the self. Now, what I've started doing with it is this, and I think I talked about this in a previous core talk, is I'm experimenting this semester with taking a very, very different approach to how I teach this book. You know, and I think I've had pretty fair success with it, and I've tried some different things over the time. I know in my regular 110, and for that matter in the 130 in the summer, I try to not use Freeland as just, okay, read it and let's sit there and talk about it. I always want to give the students something specific to do with Freeland. So for instance, one of the things I always do with chapter 3, which is what I want to talk about today, chapter 3 is on individuality. What I tend to do in the fall is I actually divide the students up into groups, and I tell them this day, I always give them two directions: bring a smartphone and bring sensible shoes. And I literally send them out onto campus, and their job is to take photographs that relate to Freeland's 4 definitions of the portrait and hence of the self described in chapter 3. In this chapter she talks about the bodily self, the relational self, the reflective self, and the moral self. And so I send them out to just take pictures. I tell them, okay, your job is to go out into the world and take pictures of people that reflect her 4 distinct categories. And then with your smartphones, email them back to me. And then run back to class, and you're going to open them up, and we're going to look at them, and you're going to explain to them in the group how this reflects Freeland's definitions. They tend to do a remarkably bad job of this, and that's okay, because this is actually one of the things I want them to do. I'm a big believer in constructive failure. And this is actually a much tougher chapter than the students want it to be. So when they come back with their pictures of the bodily, reflective, relational, moral self, they tend to not be particularly good because it's still early in the semester and they're having trouble articulating why it represents it, and that's perfectly fine, and in some ways that's what I'm looking for. But it works. But it's a tough chapter. I mean, the bodily self is, essentially Freeland's point is, when you think about the self, there are different aspects of the self. Even the bodily self, as we exist physically in this body, in my case in this drying husk, but we exist in it. But there's also much more profound issues of the self versus the person, right? And if, say, we have a brain injury, or we get Alzheimer's and we begin to lose our memory, are we still a person, but we're not really the same self? So even the bodily self is more complicated than they want to think about. You know, the relational self is, we define ourselves by the relationships that we form. We define ourselves by the fact that we're a family member, or we're a sophomore at Champlain College, or I'm a gaming major. So this is one way we define ourselves. There also is the reflective self. That is, we are thinking rational beings who have a sense of who we are, who realize that we are thinking rational beings. Which is why in chapter 1, Freeland makes the argument that you cannot really take portraits of dogs, because dogs don't really understand that they're dogs, and they're not giving them permission for you to take their picture. So there's us as the reflective self. And there's us as also the moral self, because we live in a world where we make moral decisions which define who we are. So not only are these 4 aspects that determine who we are, but they are also things that you can express artistically. And I like this. Even if the students struggle with these concepts, I think in their construction of their self-portrait, this is invaluable information for them to do with. So even when I send them out and they come back and their portraits are really kind of clumsy, that is cool, because we're teaching them to think and to deal with conceptual terms. So I do this every semester. It always works very well. It especially works really well in the summer bridge, where we're sending them out, and one of the chores is for them to gain an appreciation for living in Vermont and Burlington. So I tend to give them more time in the summer so they can literally go all the way to Church Street and run amok. Now, what I'm doing this semester is an experiment in the repeater section, but I think it's going so well I'm definitely going to repeat it next fall in the regular 110, is I'm doing artifact exploration and writing in class. I started this last fall in a 3:30 class, and I'm really trying it this semester, and I think it's worked very well. And I'm having the students do it about once every week and a half or so for chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in Freeland. So we've already done one. We did one last week on Freeland chapter 2 on contact. It's a picture I actually took in a cemetery in Lisbon, Portugal. And the students had to identify it. Now I'm going to show you one that I literally did today. And the excellent Kristen's going to turn the camera towards the screen. Thank you. Nice job. This is a painting by, as everybody knows, Gauguin. And Kristen and I were just discussing how much we like Gauguin. And Gauguin is, in fact, my favorite painter. And it's all right-thinking individuals know he's the greatest painter in world history. And this, of course, is his famous painting, When Will You Marry?, which has been in the news this week because it just sold for $300 million. It's now the most expensive painting of all time. We think it's going to end up in the museum in Doha, Qatar, even though they're kind of being secretive about it. So what I did with the students is I broke them up into groups, and all I gave them was I showed them this image. And I said, from the beginning, all you have is Freeland. You cannot do anything else. And the general framework is that within 55 minutes, actually I give them an hour, but I say 55 minutes for a little so they don't mess it up, you have to write a 1 or 2 page bulleted white paper on this using Freeland. I only let them do Freeland at the beginning. About 20 minutes in, I actually tell them the artist and the name of the painting. A half hour in, I let them actually open up the internet. But I want them to spend at least the first 20 minutes thinking about it with no sense about it whatsoever, and the first half hour doing nothing but Freeland. The reason why I think this is good is all these different categories that Freeland is talking about are here in plenty. Certainly the sense of the bodily self, how they're identified, the bodies they live in, the fact that you have 2 very different Tahitian girls, one wearing the more traditional native outfit and the other wearing this sort of more, I guess, Victorian or Christian outfit. So essentially they're defined by the bodies that they are representing to the world, and they're presenting different images. There's also the relational self in regards to how they're relating to each other. You have the woman in the forefront is wearing the flower in her hair, which is symbolic of the fact that she is reaching out. She's ready to take a lover or to take a husband. The woman in the background is looking at her askance. And so you have a sense of what their relationship is. I think the reflective self as they think about what they represent, and for that matter, the moral self, I think are all expressed here. We define ourselves as a moral being, and here you have really 2 different moral universes coming into collision here. So they have 55 minutes total to write it. I'm impressed because, again, I'm teaching the repeater section, and the kids are not normally particularly enthusiastic, but they really get into this because I let them work in groups. And eventually to bring the internet into it so they can bring some research. And several students who have not been really excited have really thrived in this kind of environment. And I think it's worked very well. So I'm going to literally do this every semester, and I will talk more about this in Core Talks down the road. But I think this works. And the reason why this is good is, think about it, they have to both, oh yeah, you can zoom back around. Thank you. Yeah, we always have to zoom back with me because I'm an old man and we don't want a close up of me unless we put like grease on the screen like they used to do in Hollywood. We in self portraits all the time, because I actually have a I'll have a core talk about self portraits because I'm a really big believer in it. But I think often we don't give them the artistic or intellectual ammunition to do a good self portrait. What I like about this approach is that we are having them use Freeland in a very constructive way. You're not just reading about Freeland's theories, you are being forced to make use of them. And it's not a huge grade. I think I've got, there are probably 800 total points in my class, or 700 total points in my concepts of the self. And this is probably, so they're doing 5 versions of it, 20 points apiece. So it's only like 100 points out of, 600 or 700 or 800 points. So it's not that much, but it's enough to make a difference in their grade. So it's kind of low scale and low stakes writing. But it is forcing them to actually use the criteria, which will then, by the time it comes down to writing their final self-portrait paper, the notion of taking the conceptual tools and using them is not such a strange notion, and I think they're going to do a much better job. So anyway, I will talk more about this later on in the semester and see how the experiment goes, but so far I'm very excited about it. Again, oddly, of all the people, I'm actually a big fan of Freeland, and I think this works very well. If you have any questions, if you want to borrow PowerPoints, as you know I live for this, let me know, and thank you very much.